really the human body is not just a collection of human cells. We're actually a composite organism. We have microbial cells as well.
Saturated fat really seems to be the worst culprit.
Try and eat for your gut microbes. Try and pick plants that are colorful and lots of flavor.
Some of the microbes, I think something like 5% of the new species that appeared were from the fermented foods.
Exercise or activity trumps, in my opinion, diet, particularly with respect to body composition and protein, like hands down.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hi friends, great to be here with you. Happy New Year. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. To bring in the new year, I thought it would be good to reflect together and consolidate some of the memorable moments and key takeaways from 2022. Over the next 2 episodes, we'll hear from a range of guests, including microbiologists, medical doctors, exercise physiologists, epidemiologists, and neurologists on a variety of topics that I believe can genuinely help each of us live better for longer. In part 1, today's episode, we traverse how to think about nutrition so we can better make sense of claims online, diet and cardiometabolic health, how you can flip the switch on your microbiome so the trillions of gut bugs in your large intestine reward you with better health, and the benefits up for grabs through consuming our food over less hours, otherwise known as time-restricted eating or fasting. Please do enjoy. Each cell in our body has its own clock, which controls how that cell behaves. This is why things like our ability to use glucose and fats for energy production and hormone levels fluctuate throughout the day. Physiological and metabolic changes that are programmed into our cells to help us achieve a biological state that prepares us for the activity that we need to do, being alert, exercising, sleeping, etc. What happens if this system becomes disrupted and we lose alignment between our physiological state and what our body needs to do, known as circadian disruption? Who better to explain this than circadian biologist and author of the Circadian Code, Dr. Satchin Panda. What's the problem, Satchin, with circadian disruption? So if these clocks are a little bit out of whack, why is that a problem from a physiological point of view and from a health point of view? And for a listener that's thinking, how would that kind of present? How would that affect them in terms of how they feel or potentially their sort of long-term health?
Yeah, so just imagine if you have an 8 to 5 job and some days, and if you are the boss, and some days some of your employees, they show up at 7:30, and then some days they can show up at 10, or they just randomly show up in the evening. They may be working hard, but then when it comes to promotion time, you may not give them a raise because they're not sticking to time. The reason is your office is also connected to the outside world through shipping, receiving, all the other stuff. So similarly, our body is wired, programmed to do certain things at certain time. And when we don't do, when our behaviors are not in alignment with what our body is programmed to do, you may not see the consequences right away. But over long term, it essentially compromises our physiology. We may not be able to digest our food properly, or we may not be able to control our blood sugar properly. So over days, months, or years, that can slowly show up as, for example, diabetes, obesity, metabolic disease. At the same time, our clocks in our immune system also make sure that we mount very strong immune reaction when we are supposed to see pathogens, which are mostly during daytime or in the evening. And at other time, the inflammation should subside, should go down when we are resting. So when our circadian rhythms are disrupted, then our immune system doesn't see that resting time or rejuvenation time. So we stay with chronic inflammation, and our risk for cancer and certain other diseases can go up. Similarly, our circadian rhythm also has downtime for our brain to repair, reset, and rejuvenate and detoxify. And if we don't sleep properly, or if you don't sleep enough, or if we have fragmented sleep, then our brain cannot repair itself, and then we can end up with affective disorder, depression, anxiety, panic attack, etc., all the way to even risk for Alzheimer's disease or dementia can also go up.
Yeah, so it really does have the capacity to affect many aspects of our health from the sounds of it. Do you have a sense as to how important circadian biology is to our health, sort of relative to some of the other big rocks that people talk about, like the types of food that we eat, or doing exercise, or smoking, or drinking alcohol? How important is kind of nurturing these circadian rhythms in the big picture?
Well, it's really hard to say. For example, smoking and circadian rhythm health are difficult to compare. So now if you think about circadian rhythms, is actually an umbrella. It's an integrating mechanism to integrate sleep, physical activity, good nutrition, all of them together. For example, if we don't sleep well, then our brain doesn't work properly to decide what to eat or how much to eat. So we end up eating energy-dense diet, or we end up overeating. So when we think of managing our nutrition, you may try to manage your nutrition, but if you are not sleeping well, or if you're staying awake late into the night, then your brain may be confused. It will actually make you that extra hungry to reach for that extra food. So similarly, when it comes to exercise, if it's a very simple example, if we haven't slept well, and if we haven't eaten properly, and if our digestive system hasn't digested our food properly, it will be really hard to hit that treadmill and stay on that treadmill for 60 minutes, or to go for a long run, or to lift weight, or whatever exercise you're doing. So that's why the three foundations of health, that's sleep, nutrition, and physical activity, they're directly or indirectly controlled by the clock. The clock tells us when to sleep and how much to sleep. The clock also makes us to be hungry and to be less hungry at night. It actually controls our appetite and satiety signal. And it also makes us, it also primes our body to do better physical activity and gain best for our buck in terms of exercise, if we exercise in the late afternoon. So in that way, this combines all these pillars of health that we know of. So when we fix our circadian rhythm, then everything else falls into its right place. It becomes much easier to pay attention to nutrition, activity, and sleep.
When it comes to weight loss, energy balance matters. Our body has to utilize more energy than we consume in order for body weight to go down. But there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to creating a calorie deficit. Some people like calorie counting, some like doing low carb or low fat, and others like narrowing their eating window, what's described as time-restricted eating by scientists. One of the prominent researchers interested in time-restricted eating is Dr. Courtney Peterson. She joins us here to better understand this tool. If someone's listening to this and thinking, very cool study, early time-restricted eating, sounds like something that I might try, but they heard us speak about the study design and they're not so keen on counting calories. And, I think there's many people out there that have tried it. They think it's mundane. It perhaps is putting too much focus on food all day. It's a lot to think about, especially if you're a busy person with kids and a job. It's just an extra task, and we only have so much bandwidth. So I guess that person might be considering, well, is there any benefit to me doing the early time-restricted eating if I'm also not counting calories? Will there still be an advantage for me in terms of my body weight and my metabolic health?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're up to just over 50 clinical trials on time-restricted eating in humans. And if you look at what are called meta-analyses, so these are sort of where you lump together the results from all the studies and you see, is there weight loss benefit? Almost all these studies have participants not count calories. And if you look at the net effect across all studies, there is a benefit for weight loss. And just for context, about half of clinical trials on time-restricted eating report a weight loss benefit. The other half don't. But when you pull all the results together, there is a net benefit for weight loss. And most of these studies don't have participants count calories. So yes, absolutely. In fact, we think one of the big advantages of time-restricted eating is you don't have to count calories. You just count time on the clock. Okay. Way easier rule for most people, right? So for our studies, when I talk to other scientists, they're kind of blown away by how little instruction we have to give people, right? Like if you came in and tried to get someone to eat a healthy diet, like a Mediterranean diet, low carb diet, you name it. There's a lot of food education that goes into that, right? And there can be financial barriers to people and logistical barriers. Like I got to come home from work and cook a meal, and then you may have to make trade-offs. Like, am I spending time with my family or am I not? But with time-restricted eating and most forms of intermittent fasting, it's a timing rule. So then it just becomes, for I think your listeners, do I want to try this or do I not? I think a lot of that is, one, I'd say there are lots of meal timing approaches out there. But second, a lot of the figuring out whether you can do it is just your schedule, right? So you might be listening to me and think, well, early time restricted eating is not for me. So what should I try instead? And I have two responses for that. So I'll tell you, most of our participants in the study did not want to do early time restricted eating. They wanted the benefit of the free weight loss program that we gave them. But after they completed the study and tried it out, 42% of people wanted to continue with it. And the really interesting thing is the people who sticked with it were the ones who got the biggest benefit in their energy levels, right? So we think that some of these benefits may offset some of the time inconveniences. Obviously, this is a super personal decision, right? Some people might say, like, I just have to have dinner with my family. My husband gets home at, 7 p.m. What do I do, right? So there are other approaches. So one is you could follow the old adage of eating breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. Or there's some data suggesting that doing time-restricted eating by skipping breakfast and eating in the middle of the day still has a number of benefits, just not as many. So 2 larger clinical trials came out earlier this year comparing early versus later in the day time-restricted eating. One of those clinical trials found greater benefits for weight loss for early time-restricted eating, greater benefits for blood sugar control, for the gut microbiota, and for inflammation. So early in the day was better. The other group also found early in the day was better for many of the same health outcomes, but there were some differences. So the second study, weight loss was about the same, whether you did early versus middle of the day time-restricted eating. But there were still greater benefits for blood sugar control and blood pressure with eating earlier in the day. But the punchline is there still seem to be some benefits from eating in the middle of the day. So that could be another approach for people.
It's a great point that you make, that the kind of education aspect of this, there's a lot less barrier to entry to kind of understand the concept.
Correct.
The bigger barrier is how do you integrate this into your lifestyle with your schedule and make it sustainable. And we kind of spoke earlier, but do you think there would still be benefits to, say, incorporating this early time restricted eating Monday to Friday? I'm thinking of the socialite here. And then on Saturday, Sunday, eating across however many hours. Do you think that would still lead to a kind of net benefit over time?
Yeah, great question. I'll answer this question in 2 ways. So one, data from animal studies suggests that if animals practice time-restricted eating 5 out of 7 days a week, they still get a lot of the same benefits. Not to the same degree, but they're still getting benefits. And then recently, for the same study that you saw published in JAMA Internal Medicine from my lab, we did what was called a per protocol analysis, where we looked at people who consistently stuck with early time-restricted eating 5 days a week, every week. And we found among these individuals, they lost more weight, they had better blood sugar control, they had lower heart rates, and they had greater improvements in mood. The other really cool, interesting thing is they slept less. And at first we were a little worried about this, right? Because normally if people sleep less, you think that's a bad thing. But what was really fascinating is they also reported greater energy levels. So I'm now wondering if they have less of a need for sleep with the early time restricted eating, because there's either better sleep consolidation or there's just a longer time to rest and repair before sleep. And so therefore they're sleeping less. And so now I'm super fascinated about the effects on sleep and trying to understand what that really means.
You just got the attention of all of the workaholics. sleep when you're dead.
I know. So we don't know for certain that this is a benefit yet, right? It could be something negative because generally we assume that. But if this is a true, genuine benefit and other researchers find the same thing, I think it would be huge. And the benefit in our study was about 30 minutes.
What would be interesting there is to look not just at the sleep quantity, but also the quality. Is it affecting?
Correct.
Is it in some ways enhancing sleep quality?
How long is the average person's eating window? And if we're going to narrow this, what is optimal? When should we start eating and when should we finish? Dr. Satchin Panda answers that.
So I'm interested in where this kind of enters this conversation with regards to our circadian biology. How many hours across the day does the average person right now, say in America, eat, and how is this affecting circadian biology?
Yeah, so the concept of eating within a certain hours, it relates to circadian biology in many different ways. One is our digestive system is primed to digest. So the overall idea is just like our brain can stay awake during daytime, solve complex math, and then wants to sleep at night to repair, reset, and rejuvenate. Almost every organ in our body also has a peak time when it can perform much better and needs some downtime to repair, reset, rejuvenate. That's the overarching principle. So now, if we look at every single aspect of our digestive system, when we eat something, it has to be digested in our stomach, and there has to be a lot of acid secretion, and then digestive juice, all the enzymes have to be secreted so that the food gets digested. It takes almost 5 hours to digest a good-sized meal, for example, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So now, let's start our math from the night time. Suppose, say, one eats around, say, 8 o'clock at night, although we finish eating at 8:15, the stomach continues to work for the next 5 hours to digest that food. So that means around 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning, that's when the stomach is finally getting some downtime to go to repair, reset, and rejuvenate.
Right.
And our stomach lining needs to repair nearly 7 to 10% of the cells that line the stomach. So there's a good amount of repair that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then our lower intestine, the food moves in our digestive system because of this peristaltic action, because the muscles contract and expand. So that's how the food moves. But that action also slows down and also almost stops because the intestine needs to sleep. So as a result, the food actually doesn't move much. So some of us who, when we eat late at night, next day we feel like the food is not digested. And it's not just a feeling. Actually, the food doesn't get digested properly because the peristaltic movement stops. So now, if we think that your stomach, just like our brain, needs 7 to 8 hours of downtime to repair. So that means if you eat at 8 o'clock and if your stomach gets a break at 1 o'clock in the morning, for the next 7 to 8 hours, it needs that downtime so that it can repair itself. Then one should not eat until at least 9 o'clock in the morning next day. So that's the simple math, just from the stomach point of view. And there are many other aspects of our digestion, nutrient assimilation, that essentially tell us that we should be eating for no more than 12 hours in a day, because we need that 5 hours of digestion after the last meal and then 7 to 8 hours of repair and rejuvenation to be ready for the next day.
Mm. And how long is the average person currently eating over? What's a typical eating window if you were just to go and grab the average American?
Yeah, so another point is we don't eat the same at the exact same time every day. So, for example, I'll give you an example and you can actually give me the answer. I'll give you some example and then ask you a question. So, for example, suppose say I eat my breakfast at 6 in the morning. Tomorrow it will be 6:15. Day after tomorrow it's 5:45. Another day maybe 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock. And if somebody asks you, hey Simon, when does Satchin actually typically eats breakfast, or when does his circadian system expects to eat food, then the answer will be around 6 o'clock. Because one day maybe I ate at 5:45, but usually around 6 o'clock, 6:15, 6:30. So now, if we do the same math and then take 2 weeks of food data from somebody and then ask what is the probable time window in which this person is likely to eat 90+% of its meal, then the number that we get is 14 hours, 45 minutes. So nearly half of the adults in the US who are not doing shift work, because for shift workers it's even worse, nearly 50% of adults eat for 14 hours, 45 minutes or longer. Less than 10% of people actually eat consistently within 12 hours or less. So that means there is room for improvement for almost all of us to improve our health just by paying attention to when we eat or when we stop eating.
Right. And you said it takes about 5 hours to sort of digest the last meal that you have at the end of the day. And then after that, you need about 7 to 8 hours to kind of get that repair process happening. Can you just define a little bit deeper what repair means? Is this where things like autophagy I often see sort of brought into this conversation? Is this where processes like that sort of come in?
Yeah, so there are many types of repair. So let's start with the gut, because during the day we eat a lot of different stuff, and then there is also enzymes and acids that are secreted, and we damage nearly 8 to 10% of our stomach lining. And you can think of this as your highway or the road, or you can think of the cobblestone road where you take out 8 to 10% of the stones every day, and they have to be repaired. They have to be physically replaced. And the way that happens is growth hormone from our pineal gland is secreted, and actually the secretion goes up with two signals. One is fasting, and second is our deep sleep. So if we haven't eaten for several hours, and if we're in our deep sleep, then the growth hormone is secreted. That gives a signal to the stomach lining to divide and replace these damaged cells or dead cells. And this is a very relatable repair process that we can think of. And similarly, in the brain, when we sleep, then many of our toxins, brain toxins, they do get secreted into the outside of the cell. It's almost like taking the trash can out and leaving it outside for the truck to come and pick it up. So that also happens. So that's like taking the toxin literally out of the body. And you also mentioned autophagy, and autophagy also occurs after several hours of fasting. So that's internal, almost like recycling process within the cell. So all three types of repair, where you are recycling within the cell, taking the trash outside the cell, and even replacing the entire cell when it is damaged. All these three types of repairs happen during our fasting plus sleep time.
And so you said we should aim for at least 12 hours of period without food, right?
Yeah.
So what would you, if we were to kind of just at this point, before we keep going, if we were to kind of define what you think is the optimal eating window and sort of translate that into what that looks like in the standard person's daily life, so not a shift worker, just a standard person, what would that look like in terms of the time that someone, say, wakes up, their breakfast, lunch, dinner, and bedtime?
Yeah, so let's start with the bedtime, because your next day actually begins with when you go to bed. So try to be consistent in going to bed, and then try to be in bed for 8 hours so that you can get 7 hours of sleep. And then after waking up, one should wait for at least an hour or two before eating anything with calories, because that's the time when our sleep hormone melatonin goes down, cortisol rapidly rises and reaches its peak, and then slowly adjusts itself. And our insulin function, our insulin secretion is adversely affected by both processes, by melatonin as well as high level of cortisol. So that's why one should avoid food for 1 to 2 hours in the morning. And then have your breakfast at a consistent time, because since our clocks get synchronized with each other and with the outside world by two signals, light and food, and actually over the last 5 to 10 years, what we are seeing is food is a much more stronger signal for all our peripheral organs than light. Light is a very good signal for brain, but food is very strong for the rest of our body. So eat your breakfast, the first meal that has calories at a consistent time, and then try to eat all your meals in the next 8, 10, or maximum 12 hours. And in most of our clinical studies, we target 10 hours because 8 hours is a little bit difficult for long-term compliance. If somebody can do 8 hours for a month, 2 or 3, that's fine. But many of us cannot do it for our rest of our life. So it's a good goal to have 10 hours, so that once in a while you can eat within 8 hours, and once in a while if you cannot and go towards 11 or 12, you are not actually breaking, not doing too much damage. So that's why 10 hours is an ideal target.
So an example of that could be 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. That might work well. Yeah. Okay, I've got a couple questions on a few things there. So one that comes up, and a lot of people sent me this, Satchin, was, okay, within that fasting period in the morning, before you have that first meal, would things like supplements or medications or tea, coffee, let's say black coffee, would they be permitted within that? I mean, no one's watching, but I'm thinking from a biological point of view. Are they going to interrupt these biological repair mechanisms that you mentioned, or would they be okay to have in that fasting period?
So again, this is a question that we cannot do any clinical trial or systematic study, even in animals. We cannot feed animal coffee every day before we give them milk. But this is where we got to use some common sense and arrive at. So there are many medications that need to be taken with empty stomach. So people should continue to take those in empty stomach. Best example is thyroid medication. People who are taking levothyroxine, that should be taken in empty stomach in the morning. So that's fine.
Sure.
Where it kind of becomes gray zone is coffee with a little bit of, people will say, I just put half a teaspoon of sugar or a little bit of cream just to make it palatable. And one thing is, it relates to what is your goal. If your goal is to lose weight or maintain your blood glucose level, then maybe a mild coffee or tea is okay. So that's why we say there are 3 exceptions to the rule. One is if your job depends on it. For example, there are a lot of shift workers. They have to wake up early in the morning. They have the morning shift. They have to be fully alert. And for them, tea or coffee is kind of having a job or no job. For example, if you're a TV presenter, you have to be awake. Second is for public safety. You should not be driving on the road sleepy. It's better to be a little bit caffeinated. And then the third one is if you really cannot function without coffee, that's the only love in your life, then you can have it. But here is the thing, how it affects. So there are a lot of people who cannot drink strong coffee or tea for long term in empty stomach because that can lead to acid reflux or even panic or anxiety attack because the body cannot tolerate the strong coffee. So if you're one of them, then try to see whether you can reduce your caffeine dose or if you can delay that for an hour or two and have it after breakfast. In fact, in Turkey, the literal meaning of breakfast means the meal before coffee, because a lot of people can have acid reflux in empty stomach. Now let's come back to the physiology and see what is breaking a fast or what affects your body so that your insulin production and everything else begins to start. So if you take me and drain all of my blood and figure out how much blood sugar I have, then the official blood sugar level for somebody healthy it should be less than 100 milligram per 100 milliliter. So that means if you find 5 liters of blood, that is the average blood that you'll find from a person like me, then I have 5 grams of sugar in my blood. And if it goes to 6 grams, then it'll be 120 milligram per 100 ml, and you diagnose me as pre-diabetic. And if I have 7 grams, then I'm diabetic because my fasting blood glucose will be 140. So that means if you add just 2 grams of sugar, half a teaspoon of sugar to your coffee or tea, that can raise your blood sugar to 140 milligram per 100 ml. That means at that time, your pancreas will begin to kick in and produce that insulin to take care of your blood sugar. So you are essentially waking up your stomach, your liver, your pancreas, and whole body. So that's why if you do the math and then think of what actually happens, then it makes sense to understand that even that tea or coffee with half a teaspoon of sugar or a little bit of cream is breaking your fast.
What about if it's just a black coffee, Satchin? I just want to dig a little deeper here. Let's just say I love coffee. To be honest, my morning coffee, I don't always have a double espresso. Sometimes I have a macchiato. There's a little bit of oat milk or something in there. So I understand that's probably going to throw you out of a fast. But let's just say it's a double espresso. What do you think about that? Are we including that or are we taking that out?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the thing is, you are a very healthy, fit person. And a lot of us who are thinking about this black coffee thing, we are really healthy and fit. I'm talking about people who really need the fasting and they just cannot live. They think, there are a lot of people who think that, hey, having tea with if you're in the UK or in India and in many parts of the world, they will think that having a cup of tea with biscuit is not breaking my fast. In fact, when we interview people, when is your breakfast time? People will say, eat at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. And then if we ask, well, after you wake up, what do you eat or drink? Then they'll say that I have a cup of tea with milk and with biscuit or something. So we're talking about those people. And they have to kind of understand what is breaking the fast. And for a lot of us, having a double espresso is actually not kicking our pancreas to high gear to produce insulin. And that, as I said, it may not break our fast. We may continue our fast.
I want to come to blood glucose and how time-restricted eating can be affecting various aspects of our health, particularly if we have sort of metabolic dysfunction or poor metabolic health. But while we're talking about healthy folks here, if someone is, let's say, lean, from a physiological point of view, all of their kind of biomarkers or risk factors are under control, is there a benefit from eating within a shortened window? Would they be getting any benefit from time-restricted eating at all?
Yeah, so there are a lot of people who complain about their sleep. So what you are seeing is both in animal studies and human studies, people who do 8 to 10 hours time-restricted eating, the first thing they mention is they sleep much better. And we don't understand the mechanism but we are seeing that the sleep improves. Another thing that we also see is a lot of people who believe they're healthy, they don't have any metabolic syndrome, they don't have any metabolic disease. They might have acid reflux, they might have bloating, might have indigestion once in a while. And that reduces their productivity. And what we are also seeing is all of these digestive issues become much better. So for example, personally, I used to have acid reflux, and many acid reflux medications would be by my bedside, and I would lose sleep sometimes. And after I started time-restricted eating 10, 12 years ago, I haven't I haven't bought any new acid reflux meds, and I haven't used them. So this is one example where people actually will benefit. And second, and another thing is, in long term, we all are healthy. We may be all healthy now, but if you think of what is our health goal, I used to say that if you can be healthy and without medication till your kids go to college or until you hit 50, that's actually a lofty goal. And you cannot do that unless you start planning very early. So time-restricted eating is almost like preparing for your retirement savings. It starts the day you start working. From that day you start saving. So similarly, to add those extra decades of healthy life, people who are healthy, they should actually start doing this.
Yeah, when you break it down that way, it makes my question look a little silly, because it would be like saying, should we eat a healthy diet today if we're otherwise healthy, or should we just wait until we have disease and then think about it? So I think you answered that well. Thank you.
At a time where nutrition can seem extremely confusing and unsettled, Dr. Gil Carvalho provides a steady voice, helping people fact-check claims using a simple, science-based framework. Here, Dr. Carvalho walks us through how to think about nutrition science, so we can be better at working out who's sharing reliable information. We talk about different types of evidence, anecdotes, mechanistic studies looking at health outcomes, and the importance of understanding the evidence hierarchy when evaluating the strength of a particular claim.
People who have a scientific training and a system of critical thinking are much less prone to confusion when exposed to certain types of content. Like if you or I watch a video by somebody just making outlandish claims on nutrition, it's much harder to confuse you or me. And that's not because we are smarter. It's not even because we have a scientific background per se. It's that we have a certain way of thinking that breaks down the arguments that are being made, and then a certain a posteriori process of fact-checking. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time. How can we break this down and distill the essential principles so that anybody without scientific training can do this and can hit the key buttons without having to spend, years digging and reading every paper on Earth? So this simple system that we came up with, we called it the 3 Ps of fact-checking, or the 3 Ps of information, clarity, whatever you want to call it. The first P stands for proof, and that's kind of self-explanatory, but basically it's a very important realization that the burden of proof is with the person making the claim. Crucial. People contact me every day with videos or blogs or posts that they say they're very confused by. And a lot of times it's just a claim with no evidence to back it up. Right?
Do you have an example of some sort of claim that could be made that is related to this?
Yeah, I mean, this happens 10 times a day. So from lectins will kill you, so you shouldn't eat beans, to whole grains are toxic because of something that happens in the gut, to some stuff with the vaccines and the pandemic and COVID. Don't take the vaccine because it will increase your risk of getting sick. It will spread. It's the vaccinated people that are spreading the disease. There are countless examples of claims that are made that confuse people, that don't even that are unaccompanied by evidence. Right? And so this first step of proof is just that mindset shift of a claim without evidence. I mean, I might as well be reading Harry Potter, right? It's like talking about my favorite color. It's like sitting there and going, my favorite color is blue. Cool. Mine is green, whatever. Right? You have to show evidence. It's not on the person receiving the message to then go fact check what you're saying just to find out if it's evidence-based or not. So even though this sounds very obvious, the truth is it disqualifies automatic DQ on like 90% of the content out there. That seems very confusing to people. So to make this clearer, what does proof look like? Normally, it's going to be a peer-reviewed study in a medical journal. Not always. If you're citing a statistic, for example, right, it could be a reputable website. It could be a poll. It could be some source of that number, of that stat. But most of the time, it's going to be a published, peer-reviewed source. Those aren't perfect, as we know. But that's where the rest of the piece come in. But it's a start. It's reliable. We're in a terrain where we can start working. We can start talking about it. We can start the conversation. Conversely, some things that are often brought up to validate these claims that are not proof. Anecdotes are not proof. You know, I stopped eating food XYZ and I now feel better. My health improved. That's not proof. We can go into the whys, but there's a lot of factors around anecdotes. All the confounders. Like there's many things that usually many variables. There's no way to control for those variables. There's placebo effect. There's 1,000 reasons why an anecdote is not a compelling. It doesn't mean the anecdote is irrelevant for the person experiencing it.
Can we pause on that for one second? You mentioned there's no way of controlling for variables. Can you just break that down? I think that's a really important point for people to understand when it comes to anecdotes.
Yeah, most of the time when somebody tries to make a point that they eliminated a certain food, this happens all the time on social media. You'll post a study showing benefit or showing harm of certain food, and somebody will disagree and say, well, actually, in my experience, I eliminated that food and I felt better. Or I eliminated that food I added that food and I felt worse. And the problem with that, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It could be right. There's a few problems. One is that it doesn't necessarily reflect what happens to the majority of people. If I'm allergic to strawberries, I could have a really bad reaction to them. Doesn't mean that they're harmful for humans, so we have to be very careful with the extrapolation, right? The anecdote could be correct and yet not be informative for the majority of people. The second problem is the confounders. Normally, people are talking about a dietary change that happened over medium to long term, but there were a number of changes happening in that person's life. They changed a lot of other things around their diet. They changed maybe their exercise. They changed stress levels. All of these things. The problem is when you run a scientific experiment, you're trying to isolate the variable, meaning you're trying to keep all the other factors as constant as you can. With the anecdote, by definition, you can't do that. You can't isolate the variable so that you can have a reasonable basis to infer causality, right? To infer that there's cause and effect between that variable and something else. I can give you a concrete example that happens all the time. When we post a study showing benefit of liquid vegetable oil, there's now this huge movement of oil is harmful, it's toxic. Some people refer to it as seed oil. Basically, liquid vegetable oils, not olive oil, but all the others: sesame oil, canola,
soybean,
flour. Yeah. So every time I or one of us posts a study showing some benefit of these oils, somebody will pop up and say, well, actually, I removed seed oils from my diet and my health is much better now. And usually when you dig into that and ask follow-up questions, what they did was they removed ultra-processed foods, junk foods, right? They lost weight, their health improved, and then they back-rationalized that because seed oils are a common component of many of these foods, then they ascribed kind of arbitrarily the blame on that nutrient. I don't think we need to spend too much time debunking that. I think most people see through that argument. And if you don't, you could just flip it to a food that you don't care about, that you have no emotional feeling towards, and you will immediately see the problem, right? You could just as well hypothesize that it was protein, because protein is included in most ultra-processed foods, or some mineral that is in most ultra-processed foods, or water, which is in probably 100% of ultra-processed foods, right? So it's a logical leap from a constellation of changes to pointing to one change, often coming from information that people are receiving from podcasts or from blogs, and so that they then fuse their experience with these ideas that they're getting, and they arbitrarily focus on one element among 300 elements that change, right? So it doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just very unreliable heuristic process, very confusing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, cool. So you were listing off what is proof, and you were essentially reeling off things that are not technically proof, and you were sort of working towards what is proof.
Right.
If we're saying that first P is, okay, someone's made a claim, what is the proof? Well, what do we mean by proof?
Right. So yeah, examples of things that will often be brought up, but that are not really compelling anecdotes. Another one I see, this one's a little more gray, saying that a food is a source of nutrient X. And this goes both ways. Sometimes it's used to condemn a food. Sometimes it's used to recommend a food. And the reason I say it's more gray is that this isn't necessarily, this could be evidence-based and it could be reasonable, but it gets used and abused. And so what I would alert to is people be cautious when that is the essence of the argument. The pillar of the argument is that the food contains nutrient X. Again, it doesn't have to be wrong, but just perk up your ears, right? If there is the reason, I mean, we both know that the type of evidence that you want to be looking for is what we call outcome evidence, are the actual health effects of eating a certain food or not eating it, or eating higher amounts versus lower amounts. This is ideally what you want to base your beliefs on in your choices. So arguments like, well, this food contains this vitamin, or this food contains that nutrient, so we shouldn't eat it. A lot of times those are misleading and can be completely off with regards to the outcome evidence. So just a little bit of caution is what I'm saying.
So that almost comes back to understanding the sort of hierarchy of evidence. And so, that becomes a little reductionist if you point to a food and you say, look, this food is, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head, is a great source of protein. But that food is associated with increased risk of cancer or increased risk of cardiovascular disease. You're sort of, missing the forest for the trees there.
Yeah. Great segue. That's the next P. We'll just jump to the next P, which is exactly stands for pyramid, and it's precisely referring to hierarchy of evidence. Because once we go past that first barrier of proof and we have some proof shown, evidence is not all created equal. So all studies do not weigh the same. And so hierarchy of evidence, if you go on Google Images and you Google that term, you'll see a lot of pyramids, because that's usually how it's represented. And the way it usually looks is that at the bottom, the lowest rung, is usually mechanistic evidence, and that's things like experiments in lab animals, or cell culture, or test tubes. So things that are not in humans, they're in surrogate systems, so-called surrogate systems. Above that, you'll have, then we get into the human experiments, not necessarily an experiment, but the human data, let's call it. And the lowest rungs of that are usually either ecological data, just kind of looking at a tribe somewhere, a population somewhere. Then you have case control studies. And then you get into the higher level evidence that is more robust, the cohort studies, the so-called epidemiology, even though epidemiology is a large umbrella, but the prospective studies. And then above that, you have the randomized control trials. And then above that, you have the large collections of data, the meta-analyses, and the systematic reviews. Another way, if this is too complicated for some people, we made a video. We wanted to make this even simpler. And so we made a video where we just showed people three bags of evidence. The first bag was mechanistic studies, so basically all the lab stuff in animals and test tube. The second bag was the prospective studies, the epidemiology, the observational studies. And the third bag was clinical trials. And that's in order of weight, let's call it.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, it's a bit more nuanced and more complex than that, because a lot of times the questions you're asking with the epidemiology and the trials, it's not the same question. It's a complementary question. So really what you want to do, rather than this simplistic, we see a lot on the internet, people dismiss entire swaths of evidence and entire fields and entire experimental approaches. The reality, we look at everything, right? We look at totality of evidence, but then you need a system to rank it. Some things weigh more than others. So that's this idea of the pyramid or the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So how would someone apply this to their daily life? If you see a surprising claim on the internet, is there proof? That's the first P. Second P, you want to walk your way to the top of the pyramid or to the heavier bags. So if you're shown a study in mice, okay, that's interesting data. We don't dismiss that. We don't pretend it doesn't exist. But we ask, cool, is there anything in humans? Does it align with that? If you're shown a study in humans that is observational, a prospective study, an epidemiological study, you go, cool, interesting data. Are there any clinical trials on this question or a complementary question, a related question? Do those things generally align? If you're shown a single clinical trial, you can ask, is there a meta-analysis of trials? Does it point in the same direction, right? So it's this idea of walking towards more reliable data.
Dr. Richard Johnson, author of Why Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, has been featured on many of the world's largest podcasts in the past few years. His research and thesis focuses primarily on the role of fructose in metabolic health. While fructose does seem to play a role, particularly in diets providing an excess of calories, something that is often overlooked is that dietary fat can also affect our metabolic health. In this clip, Dr. Johnson returned for his second appearance on The Proof, where we focused on how different types of fats affect metabolic health via liver fat and insulin resistance.
Something else that I do want to touch on is the type of fat, because you've mentioned a couple of times a high-fat diet has done this, and there does seem to be this kind of anti-polyunsaturated fat type rhetoric online, and I can't personally make a lot of sense of it. And when I was looking through a lot of these trials with you, I was finding some pretty fascinating results. And there's a couple studies here I'd like to go through, because it seems that when it comes to hepatic fat, that the type of fat matters a lot. And there was a study, and I'd like to discuss with you, and you sort of spoke about uric acid before, but if there's potentially other mechanisms here at play, the Bergermo 2012 paper, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but BJERMO, it was a 10-week study, 67 odd participants that were abdominally obese adults, and really neat. They randomized them to a high saturated fat or a high polyunsaturated fat diet, and that polyunsaturated fat diet was mostly omega-6 fats, the ones that tend to get demonized the most. And the goal was weight maintenance, but they did put on a little bit of weight. It was under a kilogram, but over the 10 weeks. And in the saturated fat group, liver fat went up by 7% relative to baseline. And in the polyunsaturated fat group, it went down by 9% relative to baseline. And these researchers were also interested in looking at inflammation and oxidative stress. And so online, you'll hear quite regularly that omega-6s are bad when it comes to inflammation and oxidative stress, but they found no increase in either of these in the polyunsaturated fat group. And their conclusion, which I have here, was that compared with saturated fat intake, omega-6 polyunsaturated fats reduce liver fat and modestly improve metabolic status without weight loss. A high omega-6 polyunsaturated fat intake does not cause any signs of inflammation or oxidative stress.
Yes, I agree with you. So let's just go back. I believe fructose is really playing a big role in driving metabolic syndrome, but it works best when it's given with fat to make works best, meaning creates the most fat when it's working with a high fat diet. But the type of fat really makes a difference. And when it comes to calories, fat is all 9 calories or so per gram. But when it comes to the type of fat, it really does seem to make a difference. And saturated fat really seems to be the worst culprit. And when you compare it to polyunsaturated fats, the saturated fat diets that when I've seen this, like the study you talked about, which is a great one, the saturated fats tend to cause more a worse fatty liver, evidence of more inflammation, a greater rise in LDL cholesterol, all the bad things. So saturated fat tends to be worse. And you're right that, there's some data that omega-3 fatty acids can really, like help block fructose effects. And there are all these studies. I've never done one of these studies, but there are lots of studies suggesting that omega-3 is really good. And that led to this concept that the omega-3, omega-6 ratio is really, really important. And these days, a lot of people are eating seed oils that are rich in omega-6. And so there's all this stuff in the internet saying that the omega-6 is really a big problem. But if you actually dive into the literature, there's not so much evidence that omega-6 is doing anything, bad compared to, other fats. Like saturated fat looks like it's the winner for being the worst loser. It's saturated fat appears to be the much worse than polyunsaturated fats, and monounsaturated fats like olive oil seem to be pretty healthy. So my guess is that that polyunsaturated fats are getting a bad shake, and that omega-3s clearly look beneficial. Omega-6, most studies suggest that they're not as bad as people are saying. But saturated fats, when you take a diet high in saturated fats, you're going to get into trouble. It's going to cause fatty liver. It's going to, it's going to raise your LDL. It's going to be associated with atherosclerosis and increased risk for heart disease. So we do need to restrict our saturated fat.
Cholesterol and heart disease. Boy, does this topic cause a stir online. Probably the most thorough episode on this topic on The Proof to date was with my Irish friends, Dr. Alan Flanagan and Danny Lennon of Sigma Nutrition. We covered just about every rebuttal to the idea that high LDL cholesterol causes heart disease. In this section of the conversation, we use a shipping cargo analogy to explain how triglycerides and cholesterol are transported through the body. And importantly, what causes cholesterol to become retained within the artery wall and build up as plaque, which ultimately causes a heart attack or stroke. And let me just say, if you are coming into this topic for the first time, this can feel a little bit like a new language. So that's to be expected. To learn more, I recommend going back to the episode on YouTube and watching it, where there are illustrations to help explain things. The way I kind of like to think about this is shipping containers. That analogy of like the shipping containers kind of floating through our blood. That's the lipoprotein, and then on top of that is the ship is the lipoprotein, and then on top of that the containers, the freight are the triglycerides and the cholesterol. And some of these ships have this ApoB protein, which makes them this kind of special class that we have said is atherogenic, which I guess is the kind of capacity to enter the artery wall and build up as plaque, which we'll probably go into.
Yeah.
Do you agree? Is that a kind of...
Yeah, that's the broadest term for an atherogenic potential.
Okay, so you've got these ships that have this certain protein. They have this capacity to go into our artery wall and potentially build up. And then you've got some other ships that don't have that protein. That's HDL. They don't have that same sort of atherogenic potential. So
And these lipoproteins are playing an important role, right? That they're distributing fats and cholesterol into tissues, so they're meant to be there at some level. They're doing a role, and I think what's interesting is to think about that and then talk about, well, what goes wrong?
Right.
You know, why would the body have this system in place that is, you know, for all intents and purposes, presumably there to actually sustain life and make us healthy? Where do things go wrong?
When it gets retained in the artery wall. So one further stratification that we can make that's important for the concept that we're talking about of atherogenicity is the size of so we've identified density, obviously, and important, and the kind of lower the density, the more room there is, so to speak, on the ship for triglyceride and cholesterol. And the expression of ApoB is important because it's ultimately that ApoB moiety, that ApoB compound, so to speak, on the ship, on the lipoprotein, that is going to be what sticks, essentially. Like
the anchor.
What adheres, exactly. So that's a really good analogy because, yes, ship goes into artery, so to speak, and drops anchor. And it's ApoB that is literally anchoring to the artery wall. And once there's a whole host of immune and inflammatory processes that will, and oxidative processes that will result from that. But a major factor influencing which lipoproteins, which ships can get in the first place, is the size of the lipoprotein itself. And size for these compounds would be measured in kind of nanometers. And what we know is that basically any lipoprotein under about 70 to 75 nanometers in diameter is small enough to get into the artery. Any compound under that, and any lipoprotein over that size is actually too large. So when we eat food and we digest the dietary fat in that meal, that dietary fat is absorbed at first into these very large particles known as chylomicrons. They're too large to penetrate the artery. So chylomicrons are not atherogenic. But what can happen is, as the body starts to break down, as enzymes start to break down the triglyceride, the fat that we've consumed in the diet that's been packaged into these really large, fluffy, buoyant lipoproteins gets broken down, you end up with progressively less triglyceride, and then as a proportion, more cholesterol there. So it creates what are known as chylomicron remnants. Those remnants can be atherogenic because their size they've been depleted. And then we have VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, which is synthesized in the liver. So the chylomicrons are the exogenous pathway of triglyceride intake, dietary fat. And then VLDL can be synthesized in the liver if the liver is having to upregulate production of new fat from an overconsumption of calories or from fat being dropped to the liver from diet and these kind of things. So VLDL exists in kind of two subclasses, VLDL1 and 2. VLDL1 is just large enough, again, not to be able to penetrate. But VLDL2, smaller VLDL, can. So we have smaller VLDL, we have IDL, chylomicron remnants, LDL itself, LP(a), and all of these fit both the classification of expressing ApoB, except for LP(a), but that's just a technicality we can avoid, and the size. And between the two of them, they're able to not just get into the arterial intima, and then ApoB, as the analogy of the anchor, is what then sticks and adheres to that artery wall, and then the processes begin.
Right, so you have these different ships. They're dropping off at certain ports.
Yeah.
Some of these triglycerides and cholesterol. Some of the containers are going off, and at a certain point, that ship, the size is now a size that enables it to enter into the artery wall and can drop its anchor and get stuck. Okay, so something I think that often comes up here is that what I would be interested in sort of understanding and speaking about is that sort of process of these particles going into the artery wall. I think transcytosis is the term that's often used. Is that normal? And does sort of these particles flow in and out, and that's completely fine and healthy, or is that pathogenic in and of itself? Because often what I hear is from the counterpoint is that, well, actually, it's not these particles that are kind of going in there and causing the damage. The only time that they would be retained is if there is already some sort of damage there, and people point to hypertension or smoking or seed oils. So I'm kind of interested in trying to delineate that what is actually causing the anchor to get dropped and the cholesterol to get retained. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it did. So the two researchers that kind of gave us one of probably the greatest breakthroughs in this whole story over the last century, Goldstein and Brown, won a Nobel Prize for it, discovered the LDL receptor in the 80s. And that has from there just accelerated almost everything we know, not just about these processes that we're discussing, but even how to intervene to treat atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And in one of their papers, they had this really nice analogy where they called cholesterol and LDL a Janus-faced molecule. You know, Janus, the two-faced god, right? And what they meant by that was we have a need for cholesterol in the body, and we have these lipoproteins, but the very properties of cholesterol, and indeed of fats in the body, fats and water don't mix. Someone can go and pour olive oil in their glass of water right now and they'll see what we're talking about. So we need compounds, and cholesterol itself is quite this waxy kind of molecule. Again, not particularly good if you're a circulatory body that has blood and plasma and fluid, essentially. We need these compounds to be able to transport beneficial material to our cells and to our tissues in order to function. The problem is that the properties from a kind of chemical perspective are that make these compounds what they are, paradoxically is also what can make them deadly if they get to the wrong place. And the wrong place in this case is into our artery wall. And so we clearly have evolved a kind of threshold at which there is sufficient capacity in the body to have these compounds on the ship, so to speak, to have enough in circulation for meeting our physiological requirements, and a range of levels in the body at which we can have these compounds in the circulation where they'll be able to do their job, drop the raw material that we need into port, so to speak, get it to the tissues that require it, and this process can go. We can forward transport cholesterol and other material to cells. We can bring it back and recycle it. Within a certain threshold, we've clearly evolved the capacity to have those functions actually work without causing any additional stress or damage to the body. Over certain thresholds is when we get into a situation where there is simply too much, so to speak, cargo and too many ships. And there is an inability at that point for the requirements for our cells for cholesterol specifically are very low. We have the capacity to synthesize that cholesterol in the body endogenously. We do require it for really important functions, but the actual level required for optimal function and the level required during maximal phases of growth in the human body are very small.
What is that? Like, give us a number.
About 30 milligrams per deciliter.
Right.
And we know that because that's what Goldstein and Brown looked at in kind of like infant development. So
is that similar to primates? So if you were to look at animals, and I think I've looked at some of this research, but if I'm correct, they don't tend to get atherosclerosis, and they have much lower level. I mean, in experiments, you can give them atherosclerosis, but in the wild, do you know what their kind of level of LDL cholesterol is?
So any other mammals that have been looked at, any other primates that have been looked at, none of these species or indeed like other animal models that have been looked at come anywhere near to expressing the levels of lipoproteins and cholesterol that modern human, particularly Western industrialized populations exhibit. And they don't develop atherosclerosis. And we have, evidence not just from, kind of hunter-gatherer, quote unquote, populations who don't develop atherosclerosis. There are some myths that have emerged even within that, particularly focused on indigenous Inuit cultures in the Arctic. That's just, a myth. This idea that they do not develop coronary artery disease is not the case at all. It was based on some shoddy assumptions in the 1970s that really haven't held true beyond that. So really, there's very little evidence of atherosclerosis developing in any of these other non-human primates who have obviously much lower levels of cholesterol in other animal species. A lot of these animal models are actually how we know the importance of the LDL cholesterol receptor of the LDL receptor generally.
So at that level, at say 30 milligrams per deciliter, let's say in a human, and I think there are the PISA study, I think is one study I've looked at that kind of looked at this and was looking at levels of subclinical atherosclerosis in different people with different levels of cholesterol. And in that paper, I think it was at 40 or 50 milligrams per deciliter. Those were the only people that didn't have any subclinical atherosclerosis. But just to kind of summarize what you're saying is if atherosclerosis is not inevitable, so if you have an LDL cholesterol level of say 30, 40 milligrams per deciliter your entire life, based on the evidence that's out there, you're saying that person would not develop atherosclerosis. Right. And is that actually, I mean, clearly there are some papers looking at it where people do have that level, but is that a level, 30, 40 is very low. Is that actually something you think people can achieve without pharmaceutical intervention?
In the modern context, probably not. But, again, a lot of unacculturated populations don't necessarily have LDL cholesterol that low or total cholesterol that low, So it seems that in otherwise healthy individuals, the threshold appears to be around 80 milligrams per deciliter. That seems to be the range up to that point where, again, in otherwise healthy individuals, atherosclerosis doesn't progress at thresholds under that. And from a number of studies that have looked at actual regression of plaque in the arteries from achieving certain targets in primary prevention, that's now the delineation for targets to treat. So in primary prevention, the aim is to get people's LDL cholesterol to 70 milligrams per deciliter or less. In secondary prevention, in people who've already had a coronary event or a cardiovascular event, they're high risk, they're already on likely a maximally tolerated statin. The aim is to further use additional pharmacotherapies, specifically now real enthusiasm for PCSK9 inhibitors, to get that LDL cholesterol down to less than 30 milligrams per deciliter in order to fully kind of rule out almost the risk of a second event. But, again, in high-risk individuals, other events still occur. But yeah, they're the two kind of distinctions we can make now in terms of primary and secondary prevention and kind of targets to treat too.
Fun fact, do you know who came up with the glycemic index? Dr. David Jenkins and colleagues back in 1991 out of Canada, a true nutrition giant. Dr. Jenkins joined us in the middle of 2022 to share insight into another facet of his extensive research career, the dietary portfolio, a panel of foods that have cholesterol-lowering properties that he and his colleagues have shown in clinical intervention trials can, when stacked together, lower LDL cholesterol levels by approximately 30%, equivalent to a low-dose statin.
In these studies, when you're getting people, I mean, metabolic study, you're sort of just giving the food to them. But in the free living ones, how are you kind of explaining the diet portfolio? Or if someone came to you today and said, I'd love to do this, how do you explain to them, the foods that they're going to be adding to their plate? What does that look like?
Well, that's what's the eating plan, as it were. Yes. Well, I mean, things like oat bran is an excellent source of viscous fibre. Soy milk has got soy protein in it. So for breakfast, why not have some oat bran with soy milk, and then why not some berries, some fruit, which are also low glycemic index and have a lot of other nutrient properties. So have some berries on some oatmeal with soy milk. And that would be useful as part of a breakfast, if you like. And quite honestly, certainly the use of things like tofu, and certainly we include the other sort of plant-based protein, soy especially protein, and legumes in general, foods. Right. We include those in the diet, so you could have bean stews as lunch. You can have sort of tofu and stir-fried vegetables for dinner. These are the sorts of way that one would change the eating pattern that you would eat. And you can have snacks with nuts, and you can have some plant sterol on the bread that you're eating with your meals. And the breads themselves, we would suggest, and we did actually provide it. We provided oat bran bread, and it was held together to some extent by a little psyllium, which is a viscous fibre. You don't have to put much in, but that makes a very good sort of fairly dense whole grain bread, so that those two can be eaten and they will lower serum cholesterol in addition. So these sorts of foods, we constructed some foods, but it's become much easier to recommend these diets as we've seen different types of foods that are manufactured foods on the market that are healthy. Now, not all foods are as measurably healthy as we would like, but we think they set people in the right direction. So that's what we're trying to do. And we do actually rely quite a lot on things like tofu and tempeh and these sorts of foods, because we think they're valuable, even though soy has been getting a bad rap for the wrong reason.
Tell me about soy quickly. So what is it about soy that made it special?
Everyone was worried. Soy's got 7S globulin fraction, which Cesare in Italy has shown has an inhibitory effect. Small peptides have inhibitory effect on cholesterol biosynthesis in the liver. Right. That seems to be one of the effects they have. They do seem to, overall, whatever the mechanism, lower serum cholesterol, even when you give it in a balanced diet. It certainly has some lowering potential. It's not big. I mean, it's maybe 3, 4, 5%. So it's not the big one on the market. But on the other hand, you've also got the displacement value you were talking about. So what is the food that it's displacing? And that would have tended to raise the cholesterol by about the same amount. So it actually those sort of foods can make a significant difference in terms of cholesterol reduction.
And as you said before, which I think is a really important point, is that sometimes you can look at a study and look at a specific food and its effect on, say, cholesterol, and you might think, well, the magnitude of that is not huge, but that's on its own. And when you stack these things on top of each other within a dietary pattern, as you say, then all of a sudden you can get quite a large shift in a biomarker, in this case cholesterol, which could be very meaningful for your health. David, when you were sort of creating the eating plan and helping folks in the studies or just patients in general understand what their kind of goals were here, were you explaining it as you kind of just did before, where you're saying, look, here's some breakfast, lunch and dinner ideas, these are foods that we'd like you to kind of eat more of, and you're pointing to, say, for example, soy and nuts and seeds and oats and eggplant, or were there any specific targets where you were like, we want you to eat this much?
You're quite right. There are targets, and we the dietitians will put out a target for what the patients on the diets actually were expected to eat per day, how much viscous fibre, how much soy protein or other legume proteins, what weight of nuts they were meant to have, etc. So these were actually pre-specified. People stuck to them about 50%. Do you know what I mean? And I think as we've gone forward, we've thought it's more important to be more positive about rather than saying what you shouldn't eat. It seems to be better to say, look, why don't you have sort of 2 ounces of oats a day or whatever a day? Why don't you have some tofu? Why don't you have sort of the equivalent of 14, 15, 20 grams of protein from tofu a day or more? See how much more you want to eat. If you want to eat less, then we would suggest that you probably had a little bit more plant sterol on your bread, because you can mix your portfolio, because it is literally a portfolio. You can mix it so that it becomes the profile of the sorts of foods that you like, and you take those foods, and we do that by trial and error as one goes along. And patients themselves are very good at finding out what they like. And then when we look at the diet history, with their diet history, we can say, well, can you modify? That's why I say I don't want to give people just a sort of straight pattern, because I think it may not help if I say, look, well, you really ought to have about 20 or 30 grams of legume protein a day. They say, what the hell's that? So one has to look at what they've got. Say, look, why don't you have some beans, peas and lentils? Have you tried, if you tried tofu? No, never tried tofu. Well, look, I suggest you go out to a Chinese restaurant and actually see what they do with tofu, see how you like it. You know, there's a lot of education that goes on. I think one's going to do this thing satisfactorily. So we do. For a time, we did have one very good restaurant that used to put on meals for all our patients, so that we could just send them off there, have a meal, learn about the food, then go and take the diet.
Yeah, well, I think, of course, social media has its good parts and bad parts, but I'd say one of the really positive things is there's a lot more recipes that are very accessible, and there's a lot of people putting up content showing how to use a food like tofu and how to make it actually enjoyable. But I really like what you're emphasizing here, that any step in that direction is going to be good, and even if you don't do this perfectly, you can still get some benefits.
Absolutely, and you can keep on building.
Yeah. I came across a chart, and I'm not sure if your group created it or someone created it after looking at your studies, but it's a chart that kind of summarizes all of this and shows the different characteristics of the portfolio diet, and then has like a sort of percentage LDL reduction you could expect to get from each of those.
Yes. Yeah,
I think it came from your group, and I'll share that with you, and if it did come from your group, I'll put that into the show notes for folks to look at a little further.
Well, I have to say that my daughters also brought out. I've just brought out a cookbook by this is a conflict of interest, I'm telling you. So I declare to the audience that these are my daughters. Therefore, I'm highly conflicted in being positive about it. And I will obviously say, of course I'm positive, and you'll have to just believe that I'm not lying. But anyway, I think it's a good book, and they spent a lot of time, spent a year putting it together. So there is a dietary portfolio book brought out by Academic Press, interestingly. So Elsevier put it out under Academic Press, and it's not a cookbook; it's a sort of dietary book explaining what the portfolio diet is about, and giving a lot of recipes. So it might be useful for some people.
When it comes to microbiome research, Doctors David and Erica Sonnenburg of Stanford University are considered to be the top of the field, continually publishing research that expands upon our understanding of the relationship between the food we eat and the health of the microorganisms that take up residence in our gut. As this clip from my episode with the Sonnenbergs sets up a slew of memorable moments focused on gut health, let's start right at the beginning. What is the microbiome?
For us, we use the term microbiome and microbiota interchangeably, and what we're referring to is the collection of bacteria, microbes that live inside our digestive system. And so microbes actually colonize the entirety of our digestive system, in our mouth, all the way through to our colon, the very end of our colon. But usually when people refer to the gut microbiome, they're talking about the community of microbes that lives in our large intestine or colon. And that's because that's where the majority of these bacteria live. So even though we have microbes in our stomach and our small intestine, most of the work, scientific work, has been done on the microbes that live in our colon.
So tell me about the relationship between the bacteria in the colon and our own physiology. I know growing up as a kid, I used to hear bacteria and I thought, ooh, that's a germ. We don't want that. And so I'd love to understand a bit more about this relationship. And also, this may seem like a silly question, but what would happen if we didn't have microbes?
I think, like you, I grew up also thinking about bacteria as germs. I mean, you get sick and you take antibiotics. That's supposed to kill bacteria, right? So we're all sort of grow up thinking that bacteria are bad things. But really, most microbes are in fact either beneficial or benign, don't really do anything. It's a small percentage of microbes that actually cause disease. But of course, they get a lot of attention because of the problems they cause. But really, the human body is not just a collection of human cells. We're actually a composite organism. We have our human cells, but we're also host to a huge number of microbial cells as well. And so this ecosystem between our human cells and our microbial cells is, really a fascinating field of study to understand how these two parts of our biology, our microbial half and our human half, work together, and how these two halves we can adjust, how they're functioning so that each side functions better and leads to better health.
And just to add to that, I think this question of like, what would it look like to not have a microbiota or to not have any microbes? We have to consume food. Food has to pass through a digestive tract. And of course, until recently, it wasn't possible to eat sterilized food. So microbes are everywhere. And so just by virtue of the fact that we're consuming, things in the environment, these foods, we're going to be consuming bacteria. And so that means the bacteria can transit our digestive tract. Ones that are adapted to take up residence there can start to live there. And it would just take an overwhelming immune response, so much energy to put into the immune system to try to cleanse to cleanse our digestive tract and keep it sterile, that, over evolutionary time, we've worked on this relationship where we can have microbes there that by and large don't cause disease and help exclude many of the pathogens that do cause disease. And so I think one way to think about this is, over evolutionary time, we have cultivated a relationship with a group of microbes that can on the one hand, exclude pathogens, take up the niche space in our gut and kind of occupy it. So they provide competition for the bad guys. And then the beauty added on top of that is these microbes can do all sorts of other wonderful things for us, like help us digest food and, synthesize molecules that appear to be important for our health. And, then a lot of other things that have happened, over the course of evolution, where we've actually become reliant upon the signals that our microbes produce for different aspects of development and metabolism.
So another kind of very basic question from me here, and excuse me if this is again a silly one, but I'm wondering, we talk about bacteria helping us digest parts of our food and the indigestible components of carbohydrate, in particular, fiber. Why is it that we have outsourced that? Why can't our own cells perform that function?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. If you look at the capacity for degrading complex carbohydrates that the microbiome encodes, it's just massive. It's, tens of thousands of genes compared to just a handful of genes that we encode. So it would be a pretty big endeavor on our human genome's part to try to encode all of this. The other thing, advantage to having, it not encoded within the human genome is because, you're sort of stuck with your human genome that you have at conception. Your microbiome is actually adaptable to your environment. So your microbiome can more closely match the carbohydrate environment of your food. So, for example, say you grow up in Japan and you eat a lot of seaweed. We know that there are microbes that are able to degrade these complex carbohydrates found in seaweed. So if you just pick up one of those microbes, now you're able to use that carbohydrate source as a nutrient source for you. But if you grow up in another part of the world where seaweed isn't part of your diet, your human genome doesn't have to worry about it. You just don't pick up a microbe that encodes that. You instead pick up microbes that encode the degradation of the carbohydrates that match the diet that you're eating. So it does provide this advantage of having, sort of a bespoke microbiome or a bespoke capability to degrade the food source that you are actually consuming at that time.
And if you grow up in the US and you move to Japan, you can potentially pick up a microbe that helps you degrade a local food that you might start eating partway through your life. So it is this really malleable component of our biology that can adapt to aspects of our diet. Now that presents a vulnerability to this malleability, in that microbiota can deteriorate and change potentially in ways that are not beneficial to our health. We can talk more about that, but it does represent an aspect of our biology that is malleable and therefore advantageous in certain respects.
Yeah, I mean, there's hope in that, right? There's opportunity to kind of modulate it and restore it, which is, of course, what a lot of your work is centered on.
In 2021, Professor Christopher Gardner teamed up with the Sonnenburg lab at Stanford to conduct a study comparing fiber to fermented foods, with a particular focus on how each affects microbiome diversity and inflammation. There were some interesting findings from this trial, often misrepresented online. Here we learn about them from the investigators themselves.
You run this study of the 4-week kind of run-in period, and then you have 10 weeks, these two different arms. One group is upping their fiber, as Dr. Gardner explained. The other group's adding these 6 serves of fermented foods to their diet. You're taking blood samples. There are stool samples. You're looking at inflammation and the diversity of the microbiome. What do you see?
Well, and just to clarify the design, so we had a 3-week baseline period where the participants didn't do anything. There was a 4-week ramp period and then a 6-week maintenance period. So that total intervention time, including the ramp, is 10 weeks. And then there was a 4-week kind of washout, choose your own kind of, they could stop or they could continue the food as they liked it. Traditionally in these sorts of studies, there's a washout where you stop treatment, but Christopher wisely refuses to make people go back to a crappy diet after teaching them how to eat good food. And so we let people choose whatever they want at the end of for the washout period. So we collected blood and stool longitudinally over that entire time. And the very simple analysis here is just to ask the question of what do these participants look like at baseline? What do they look like at the end of the study? And is there a change that's happened across the cohort? And the really big signal that was very impressive was there were two really for the fermented food group. One was an increase in microbiome diversity. So these people somehow increased the number of microbial bacterial species in their gut microbiome, and many markers of inflammation decreased over that same time. And in fact, even if we look at intermediate time points, so not just the beginning and end, but the intermediate ones as they were progressing, we see a gradual increase in diversity over the fermented food intervention and a gradual decrease in these inflammatory markers. So it's kind of the result that you would hope to see for a healthy dietary intervention in a Western cohort. I will say that, my hypothesis, and I think much of the field to this point would hypothesize based on work that's been done in animal models and so forth, that sort of signal would be expected in the high fiber group, not the high fermented food group, because fiber is, what we're missing in our diet, in the Western diet. Bringing it back should allow for recruitment of new microbes, should allow for a bunch of fermentation end products of these microbes to go in and dampen inflammation. So we saw the signal that we expected. It was just not in the intervention arm that we expected.
In fact, Simon, he wrote me an email and he said, are you sure you got the groups right? Can you go back and tell me, we've been blinded to this whole time, A and B. Is it really B and A? Because I think you might have mixed those up when you sent them to me. Justin, would you add to this? I think one of the critical points is that in Justin's lab, they did a very thorough job, Simon, of going out and purchasing some of the same products and the same brand names that the participants were choosing, because we did make recommendations. And you might expect that the microbes that were in those foods would appear in your gut. But really the increase in diversity that we saw was far beyond those specific microbes. Justin, you want to take that?
Yeah. And just to add to that, there were some of the microbes, I think something like 5% of the new species that appeared were from the fermented food. So that confirmed that we didn't, there wasn't any mislabeling of the arms that occurred. It really confirmed that this was the fermented food group and that many of the species came from somewhere else.
On that point, and my understanding was probiotic supplements, for example, when you take them, those probiotics may have sort of transient effects in the body, but they don't stick necessarily. And I may be completely wrong there. Are you sort of saying that some of the bacteria in the fermented foods seem to take up residence within the microbiome, or is that something that you would need to kind of test over a longer period of time to determine?
Yeah, we'd probably need to test that over a longer period of time. There was a decrease in those species through the washout period, but again, some of these people were still consuming fermented foods. Most of them were consuming some, and so it's hard to know whether that signal was stable colonization versus additional fermented food microbes that were running through. There is, it's interesting. Probiotics come in, different flavors. There are some probiotic bacteria that were originated in fermented foods and therefore are, for instance, milk adapted, many of the, lactobacillus species, for instance. There are other probiotics that originated in infant feces infant stool many of the bifidobacterial probiotics. And those were used decades ago to cure diarrhea in infants that were suffering from diarrhea. And they've been used for so long and have such a great safety profile. They now are allowable as probiotic supplements, even though they're derived from the human GI tract. And there are actually even some lactobacillus that were originally derived from the human GI tract. So the origin of the probiotics matters, because in some studies, if you take a milk fermented food adapted strain, it most likely will not take up residence in your gut because it's not adapted for your gut. Mm-hmm. But in trials that have been done with, for instance, bifidobacteria that are gut adapted, the bifidobacteria will take up permanent residence if there's an open niche, if that strain doesn't already exist in the gut microbiota. So quite often in these studies, you'll see there's a really beautiful study from Jens Walter's group showing that about half the people stably engraft the probiotic strain, and half of them don't. Half of them, it just washes through and disappears. And so anyway, some of these probiotic strains can stably engraft. In our study, we think that these are probably mostly just transiently appearing and disappearing, but the vast majority of the diversity are gut resident strains, probably not originating from the fermented foods. We don't know exactly where they're coming from.
Okay, we might come back to that point around probiotics and microbiome testing a little later if we talk about personalized nutrition and some of the tests that are or the toolkits that are becoming available. On this fermented food group, what was the average consumption? That sort of 6-level target, is that where subjects got to? Was there any difference that you saw perhaps in subjects that consumed less serves on average per day compared to those that consumed more? Or was there any information around particular fermented foods that seemed to have a sort of unique effect on the microbiome?
So it was less, in terms of dose, the sample size wasn't large enough to see a dose effect. But as I was trying to explain earlier, what if you really hated kimchi? Does that mean you couldn't be in the study? What if you really weren't willing to drink kombucha? And so they could get their 6 serves a day any way they wanted. And in fact, some people really preferred the yogurt. And some people bought these gut shots that they were taking that originally weren't in our list, but that qualified. And when Justin and the group analyzed the data, there were some specifically larger contributions from some of the foods. So Justin, take that back.
Yeah, that's right. So, it was, by design, this study was meant to not test individual fermented foods. It was just to get people eating diverse mixture of fermented foods. But we could go back and see if there were, larger effects, for instance, on gut microbiome diversity of people that ate more yogurt or drank more kombucha. And so in doing that analysis, it really looks like the biggest impact in our study was yogurt, followed by actually a fermented vegetable brine drink that is commercially called gut shots. It's basically just the salty liquid from fermenting sauerkraut. It's interesting and notable that both of these products are high in lactic acid. They have lactic acid in them. And there's some fermentations that tend more towards acetic acid, like, taste more vinegary, and other ones that taste more mellow due to lactic acid. And so we're actually, one of the beautiful things of working with Christopher's group is to generate all these hypotheses that are based in human studies, and then to be able to reverse translate those back into our lab and study them in animal models. And so right now we're testing in the lab using a mouse model whether lactic acid can have an outsized impact as one of the prime microbial metabolites in fermented foods that seem to have a big impact on gut microbiome diversity.
Very cool. So perhaps not all fermented foods are created equal.
Exactly.
I'm interested, before we kind of flip over to the Fibre arm and what you noticed there, because that was also very interesting. This fermented food group, you saw on the aggregate a reduction in some of these inflammatory markers. I'm interested in, firstly, what you hypothesized was going on here. What is it specifically about the fermented foods that you think was causing this reduction in inflammatory markers? And I also wonder, and this is probably a little bit of a nerdy question and perhaps digressing, but I'm curious if you thought about measuring intestinal permeability at all. I know that some studies look at zonulin, and there seems to be some kind of debate as to whether that is a good biomarker and measure of intestinal permeability or leaky gut, so to speak.
Right. So the inflammatory markers, so just to back up one tiny step, and we covered this a little bit in the intro, but, I think it's classically in, the immune system is tremendously complex. And so classically, there hasn't been a great way to monitor people's inflammation status. And there, are studies out there that monitor, for instance, C-reactive protein or CRP, other studies that monitor other markers like, interleukin 6 or IL-6. There are these very specific markers, but these are, two of, hundreds to thousands of different facets of the immune system that one could monitor if the technology existed. And we really reasoned that a broader readout of inflammatory status was going to be important to get a broad view of where the immune system was sitting. And part of this is embedded in the hypothesis that chronic simmering inflammation in the industrialized world is what's driving many people in our society towards these different chronic diseases, like, everything from heart disease to cancer to autoimmune disease. And so we were really looking for something that could move the needle on a broad array of markers indicating less simmering inflammation, with the hope that, potentially one day we could study and would show less Western disease development in people that had lower inflammation. So that's kind of the backdrop here. We have a wonderful human immune monitoring center at Stanford that allows for looking at 300 to 400 different markers of inflammation for each blood draw. And so that's what we did over the course of this study, was monitor a really broad array, kind of what we call comprehensive immune profiling, to get a sense of people's immune system. And we saw 20 to 30 of these different markers decrease over the course of the intervention. So really this broad signal of decreasing inflammation. So very, very convincing signal. Now, what you are asking is what was causing that? And that's kind of the $1 million question. And really one of the detractors of doing experiments in humans is getting to the mechanistic insight. So we know from a study like this, we get information that we know is relevant to humans. It relates to diet, it relates to our microbiome, gives a really robust signal in the immune system. But being able to iterate on the experiments and ask follow-up questions of, was it the bacteria in the fermented foods? Was it the metabolites? Was it lactic acid? Was it something that was happening in the small intestine? Did it even depend on the gut microbiome? Could this be fermented foods interacting with our gut lining directly? So these are all follow-up questions that we're pursuing now in mouse models to iterate on this and try to get to the mechanistic explanation. But you hit on a really important question here. We'd love to know why it is fermented foods are causing decreases in inflammatory markers.
Do you see that approach as a sort of more effective, better use of time for science going forward, where you first try and start in a human setting and then work backwards, as opposed to running lots of animal studies and working forwards?
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful about, I think both of these approaches are incredibly important. There's been a tremendous amount that we have learned from just the mouse studies, and there's an aspect of being able to do biomedical science and be able to conduct research that's translational and impacts humans, that relies upon this tremendous foundation of basic science being done outside the context of human studies. And so I really think the two complement one another very well. I think what we don't want to get trapped in is explaining mouse biology for the sake of doing beautiful science. We want to use mice in a really either way to inform broad principles that give us this like broad foundational knowledge, or in this reverse translational sense. So I think we have to use both methods complementary. in complementary ways. But I do think that this way of doing microbiome science, where you start in a human and you reverse translate to understand it, is incredibly powerful and being embraced by more and more people around the field now. And then to your question about the permeability, this was looking at leaky gut in this study, this was something that we considered and talked about. And the methodology for this is, it's evolving rapidly right now in the field. You mentioned zonulin. There are other ways of looking at different sugar markers that are not metabolizable but can be absorbed either through natural transport processes or through a leaky barrier, and looking at ratios of sugars can be a marker of leaky gut. And so we considered a lot of these and decided at the end of the day, we're stuck with a finite budget and a finite number of things that we can study, and trying to target that to the assays that we think are the most robust and the most likely to give us a signal. So at the time, the leaky gut assays didn't make the cut. They were a little bit too complicated and a bit of a leap into the unknown for us, but I think they're of huge interest and are kind of on the menu continually, and we'll probably be incorporating those into upcoming studies.
Friends, just a quick intermission to tell you about my brand new recipe book, Plant-Based Ferments, a collection of must-have recipes that will take your fermented food game to the next level, nourishing your microbiome and saving you dollars on your grocery bill at the same time. The soy labneh and homemade kombucha are probably my favorites. I'm often asked by folks in the community how best to support my work. I don't sell much, but if you have been getting value from the show and you want to show your support and improve your gut health, then check out Plant-Based Ferments. It's $12, has a few thousand words I wrote on fermented foods, including some frequently asked questions, and 15 recipes that are professionally shot and styled. To get your copy, head to theproof.com/ferments. Some of the most informative lectures I've had the privilege of listening to have been delivered by Dr. Erica Sonnenburg on the microbiome. So let's bring her back here to chat about encouraging better microbial diversity through the food we eat.
So let's talk about food and restoring microbe diversity. When it comes to our diet, if we want to encourage this very rich, diverse ecosystem of trillions of bacteria in a beautiful balance that are rewarding us, they're helping keep that mucosal layer nice and thick. Our intestinal cells are happy. They have an energy source. Inflammation's down. What are we doing from a dietary point of view?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and something that our lab is actively studying. If you look at all the data from both animal studies and now some more recent human studies, it looks like there's sort of two factors of diet that have emerged as important for a healthy microbiome. One we've talked a lot about, which is dietary fiber. So these complex carbohydrates we know is what these gut microbes rely on for their energy source. Our human genome doesn't encode much of a capacity to degrade them. So it's clear that we rely on our gut microbes to digest these complex carbohydrates. Then they create all the small molecules Justin was talking about, short chain fatty acids and other chemical compounds that affect our physiology. So a diet rich in complex carbohydrates seems to be an important facet of maintaining a healthy microbiome. The other aspect of diet that looks like is going to be very important is the consumption of fermented foods. So these are foods that contain live active microbes that when people consume that food, it both lowers inflammation in general and also increases microbiome diversity. And so it's sort of that, again, back to that good and bad microbe situation. In the industrialized world, we don't want to go back to a place where we don't have access to antibiotics and we don't have access to clean water, but we also need to make sure that we're exposing ourselves to microbes, because that's, from an evolutionary standpoint, what our body is expecting. It's expecting to see microbes on a daily basis. And fermented foods, we think, is an easy and safe way to expose yourself to microbes in a way that's beneficial and doesn't expose ourselves to disease-causing bacteria. So fermented things like dairy products, yogurt, and then fermented vegetables like sauerkraut, kimchi. These things are just teeming with healthy bacteria that when people consume them on a regular basis, improves microbiome diversity and helps with inflammation.
And we can also talk about like what is good to not have in the diet that may be beneficial for the gut microbiome. I think the, Western diet, it turns out, is probably a model of what not to be eating when it comes to trying to foster a healthy microbiome. There's, high sugar is probably some, or high glycemic foods, simple starches and things like that are probably problematic in multiple respects. One is providing a really rich kind of bacterial media environment in the small intestine. And we know that SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and other small bowel disorders are becoming more prevalent in industrialized countries. And this corresponds with just eating a diet that's really rich in simple nutrients. And if those simple nutrients exceed the absorptive capacity of the small intestine, that is, we can't get them into our bloodstream fast enough, it really creates a rich nutrient environment for bacteria to grow very rapidly within our small intestine, which is probably a huge deviation from the diet that humans had for most of our evolutionary history, which is a diet rich in plant material that has relatively low glycemic index. So I think that the simple nutrient diet may present a lot of problems for small intestinal microbiota overgrowth and weird metabolism to be occurring. I also think there's just, a lot of emerging data associated with emulsifiers, these chemicals in processed foods that increase shelf stability. These appear to be problematic from the standpoint of disrupting the mucus barrier. Artificial sweeteners appear to be problematic from the standpoint of misregulating the microbiota in various ways, and that can lead to metabolic syndrome, for instance, in animal models. So there's a lot of things that we're missing in our diet that are beneficial for the gut microbiota, and then a lot of things that are now included in the Western diet that are probably problematic for gut biology and the microbiota.
In most settings, it's a difficult task for medical doctors to educate patients about diet. 10 to 15 minute consultations with perhaps just a few minutes to touch on nutrition. This means doctors need to be super clear and specific with their communication in order to be effective. I wondered what Dr. Tim Spector, medical doctor, epidemiologist, and science writer, would say to a patient when short for time.
If you were sitting down as a physician with a patient and you could give them 3 or 4 or 5 sort of bullet points that you felt were far more beneficial than referring someone to this dietary guidelines as they are now, what would that piece of information look like?
If I was really keeping it very simple and high level, I would say try and eat for your gut microbes. Every time you think of food, if you're eating for your gut microbes, you're not going to go far wrong. And if they say, oh, what does that mean? I'd say, well, eat as many diverse plants as you can in a week. And I say, try and go for 30. Remember that nuts and seeds and herbs and spices are all part of those plants. Try and pick plants that are colourful and have lots of flavour because they've probably got polyphenols in it, which are rocket fuel for your microbes. Have fermented foods, which are good for your microbes. And you give a list of remind people what they are. Many Brits and Australians don't regularly have them, so you might there is this stuff called kefir and kombucha and kimchi and sauerkraut, as well as yogurt and cheese, and just say your gut microbes don't like ultra processed food much, so really try and cut that out. And then if they ask, is there anything else I could do? Well, I say, well, you could try restricted time eating because your gut microbes like a long rest period. They like to sleep in. Give them a long time. So I think if every doctor told their patient that, I think it would help a lot more people than reciting these sort of biblical diet guidelines.
We know muscle is important for being physically able, moving our body up and down stairs, getting up off the floor, getting in and out of the car, etc. But muscle is also important for our metabolic health. And by that, I mean our ability to manage blood glucose and blood lipids, getting nutrients to where they need to go, and preventing storage of fat where it shouldn't be, around our organs. To walk us through this, here's Dr. Don Layman.
I mean, you mentioned their metabolic health and the importance of skeletal muscle. And I think for some people, that might be the first time that they've kind of really heard that or thought about that. And often, I guess, at a high level, you think more of muscle of, helping you do functional things, get up off the couch or lift a weight at the gym. So perhaps we just take a further step into the importance of having a good amount of skeletal muscle. What do we understand about the amount of muscle that we have, particularly as we age, and how that does intersect with our metabolic health?
Yeah, so muscle makes up, depending on your body composition, or 50% of your body, 50% of your protein. And as we age, as we get beyond 40, the efficiency of how the body maintains it tends to start downward. Muscle is a major source of glucose metabolism. It's a major source of fatty acid metabolism. And if you have problems with blood sugar, with blood lipids, chances are your muscles aren't healthy. So we talk about them from dietary standpoint or heart standpoint or all kinds of things, body fat, adipose standpoint. But the reality is muscle is really where it all begins. And unless you're super physically active, that is on a downward trend as we get older. So, how do you manage that? What can we do about it? Those are all topics I think are really interesting. And I think we can do things to make it better.
When we say, a good amount of muscle, and if you were to kind of think about as we age, often you hear people saying, do resistance training. It's important to maintain a good amount of muscle. And I'm kind of assuming that there's a bit of a spectrum where you go from sort of under-muscled, where maybe you are putting yourself at risk of some of these negative metabolic consequences, to having sufficient muscle. Is that something that we've been able to quantify within the research? What is a good amount of muscle? If someone's listening and thinking, well, I'd love to know if we know that firstly, and then if I can test it.
Yeah. I don't think there is any really good number. We typically think of it from the other direction. We think about what's an unhealthy amount of fat. Well, we think that, if you've got more than 30% body fat, then you're likely going to be at health risk. So, that means the rest of it's lean body mass. What percentage of that is muscle? I don't have a real number to give you on something like that. I think that you really look, and again, somebody who's 6'6" is going to have a different level of muscle than somebody who's 5 foot, and they both can be perfectly healthy. So, the issue is, how functional is it? What are you doing? Are you physically moving? Are you physically active? Is it metabolically healthy? And you can be, both the activity and the nutrition are hand in hand in terms of how healthy it is. So I don't think the amount is the key. For any individual, for you or me, we could simply say, well, for me, X amount of muscle is probably a good healthy level, but that's probably quite different than what it would be for you.
Is this where strength comes in? Is strength a kind of better proxy for sort of determining our risk of, say, frailty or even total mortality? I often see grip strength used in the literature quite a bit.
Certainly mobility in the aging literature, which functional aging is not exactly my specialty, but walking, gait speed and ability to get up out of a chair, and some of those are very much predictors of health and mortality. So strength is certainly part of it. I also think a lot about the metabolic aspect, which someone can be fairly metabolically healthy and not necessarily be super strong. I don't personally think that resistance exercise is the key to metabolic health. Sort of the flip side of your question. So I personally think people need to practice some level of both resistance, HIIT type of exercise, some level of resistance and some level of aerobic, because they're not the same outcomes.
And when you mention metabolic health, translate that for someone listening. Like, what in terms of actually measuring something, are you talking like HbA1c or fasting blood glucose? What are we talking about when we mean metabolic health?
Yeah, so I focus a lot on protein turnover. So having good rates of protein synthesis, responding correctly, I think that's important. I think blood glucose, blood lipids are also important. Your mitochondrial health determines your ability to oxidize blood lipids. So, those are the kinds of things I think about with metabolic health. Do you have the right level of branched chain amino acids? Are you metabolizing your lipids? Are your triglycerides in your blood at the right level? All of those things are part of that package.
So would you say the goal here, from your view, the goal here is to have a sufficient amount of muscle, whatever that is for the individual, to act as a good way to kind of dispose of blood glucose, to metabolize glucose, and at the same time, healthy functioning mitochondria and trying to avoid that sort of visceral fat buildup around the organs. Is that a kind of decent summary of metabolic health?
Yeah, again, the amount, it's about activity. The larger your muscles are, if I started lifting more weights, I would convert muscles toward white muscle type. I would have less mitochondria per unit of muscle. So that doesn't necessarily make it better for metabolizing glucose. I approach it quite differently. I think about, what's my calorie need? What's my carbohydrate threshold? So there's a minimum need of carbohydrates of around 130 grams per day. We could debate that number. But then I think about, you can add about 60 grams per hour of intense exercise. The question is, how do you balance all of those things? And that relates to your muscle mitochondria. So are you doing aerobic activity? The strength aspect sort of lets, are you strong enough to do those activities functionally? But the size of the muscle doesn't necessarily lead to metabolic health. If you want to think about animal research a little bit, there's classic things in like the swine industry where if you over muscle an animal, it becomes metabolically incredibly unhealthy. They're very prone to lactate toxicity and things like that. So big muscles isn't the answer. Healthy muscles is more of a mitochondrial and functional mobility as opposed to just big.
You might have heard of growth hormone and IGF-1, hormones our body manufactures that regulate growth of cells via pathways like mTOR. Such terms typically come up when we're talking about aging. What are these hormones and pathways? And if we are wanting to slow down aging and our risk of disease, what should we consider? Author of Longevity Diet and creator of the fasting mimicking diet, Dr. Valter Longo, joins us to talk about this. If someone's hearing this for the first time, these keywords of mTOR and IGF-1, and let's say you meet someone at a dinner party, Valter, and they say, Dr. Longo, you're speaking another language, slow down. What do these abbreviations actually mean? And for the sort of lay person out there,
where are these pathways found in the body and why are they important? What is their purpose?
Yeah, so IGF-1 refers to insulin-like growth factor 1. And so, not surprisingly, is the main factor in the blood making us grow, right? So we follow these little people in Ecuador, and they have extremely low IGF-1, and they're about 3 feet tall usually, right? So they're born with this growth hormone receptor deficiency, and the result of that. So growth hormone basically regulates the levels of insulin-like growth factor 1. So if you have a low growth hormone receptor, you have low IGF-1. And the other one that you mentioned is TOR, target of rapamycin. And so this is a X downstream, but also somewhat parallel to IGF-1. And so TOR is also at the center of growth. And this is how we identified the TOR cis-kinase pathway over 20 years ago. Its role in aging, because we saw that when we mutated very simple organisms, the ones that lived the longest were dwarf. They became much smaller, but we could make it live 3-5-fold longer than the regular ones. And that was a mutation in the TOR cis-kinase pathway, meaning we inactivated TOR cis-kinase, and all of a sudden these little microorganisms, they could live a lot longer. So yeah, that's a target of rapamycin. Rapamycin then, not surprisingly, is a drug that ended up being demonstrated to extend the lifespan of mice, and in a way that I think most people will say is superior than anything else we've seen in history, right? So seems like blocking rapamycin, especially if you start in middle age, works better than anything we've ever seen. So that those are TOR and IGF-1, and so we and many other. In fact, I almost 10 years ago I organized a conference where we brought all the top geneticists and experts in the biology of aging from all over the world, and we asked the question: what is the best target to extend human lifespan and health span? And the consensus was that the growth hormone IGF-1 was the very top. It's the one that got most votes. It didn't get everybody's vote, but certainly got most votes. And in that paper, we wrote a paper about that. And then in the paper, we actually put the votes. We wrote down who was present. All the present were authors of the paper. And then so then I think that not the consensus, but certainly the most votes go to growth hormone receptor or IGF-1.
Are these pathways in all tissues of the body, or are they only found in certain cells like muscle cells, or will you find sort of mTOR and these kind of growth pathways throughout all tissues?
TOR is everywhere, and so is I would say the IGF-1 is in the great majority of cells. Probably not all of them, but let's say the great majority. Now they in different cells and different tissues, they can have very, very different effects, right? So some cells in some moments have the job of making glucose, like liver, and some cells have the job of, at the same time, of using glucose, right? So you can imagine how a brain cell and a liver cell during a starvation period would do something very, very different. One is trying to deal with fasting, and one is trying to do its job of functioning normal as possible, right? So yeah, but then just to tell you, these genes and proteins are everywhere, but they can have quite different jobs depending on the state.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I feel like there's some kind of general fear out there around these pathways, but from my understanding and reading your work and others, is that these are very, very important and they're critical. But are we talking about sort of when they become hyperactive, overactive, that we see deleterious effects in physiology?
Yes, I think a good example is insulin, right? So if you think about 50 years ago and you think of insulin and you think of insulin as a very, very positive hormone. And then, but then it took a while, right, to realize that if you have too much insulin all the time, then you become insulin resistant. And then you have diabetes, right? So it's the same or similar with these growth factors that you have to have the right amount, and there is probably at some point in some tissues you might develop resistance to these growth factors, but you also might develop hyperactivity of these factors, leading to all kinds of problems. And so in cancer, certainly lots of epidemiological studies and our own studies and mouse studies. And so there's a lot of different type of studies, including the genetics one, suggesting there is a tight link between the levels of IGF-1 and cancer, but also the levels of IGF-1 and lots of other problems. So meaning that if you have a lot of it all the time, you're probably not going to do very well. And not surprisingly, people that have acromegaly, so they're born with very high levels of IGF-1, they have a short lifespan, and they die fairly early from all kinds of problems.
As we get older, it gets more difficult to preserve muscle mass. Sometimes this leads people to make the claim that we should just dial up our protein to super high levels when we get older and problem fixed. Easy peasy. But is sarcopenia and loss of muscle primarily a protein problem? What else do we need to consider here? Dr. Stuart Phillips and Dr. Christopher Gardner provide greatly needed context to this topic.
If we are thinking about the preservation of skeletal muscle as someone ages, so you said earlier that as people age, their protein intake is dropping off. Now, I'm also going to go out on a limb here and say that they're becoming more sedentary. And as I understand it, when it comes to the stimulus for preservation of muscle tissue, resistance training is a much greater stimulus than protein intake. So my question to you is the problem a lack of protein, or is it a lack of resistance training and stimulus? You know, I learned in my undergraduate career, or undergraduate degree, I should say, that, you know, when it comes to physiology, structure reflects function. So how much of this problem is caused by a lack of protein as people age versus a lack of exercise?
Yeah, great question. Clearly, you've been reading my Twitter feed. So yeah, I would never argue. Exercise or activity trumps, you know, in my opinion, diet, particularly with respect to body composition and protein, like hands down. We don't have the money or resources to do the type of studies where we control diet strictly enough to look at the effect of protein on body composition. But from an observational standpoint, older people who consume more protein hang on to more muscle. They don't progress towards frailty. They fall less. And, you know, much again to a number of people's chagrins, they don't live shorter lives. And so, you know, as laudable goals for an aging person, I look to, you know, some of the issues around, you know, falls, which are, you know, key watershed moments, and say, well, I don't know. It seems that there's an association with greater protein that may reflect greater physical activity. And if that's the case, then you're preaching to the converted. You wouldn't get me off this show without me saying that, you know, exercise or activity is king and diet is queen. So, and if that means a hierarchy, then I guess I would be supporting that notion.
Mm-hmm. But are you saying as well, just to be clear, in elderly populations where protein intake has been assessed, are these populations consuming under that 1.2 gram per kilogram sort of target that you mentioned?
Some are. It depends. I mean, like the frailer and the more sedentary individuals, yeah, you can get them below the RDA. Some of them are close to the EAR. Interestingly enough, you put an older person in hospital for a knee replacement or a hip replacement and do trace studies on what they're fed in hospital or what the time they spend in hospital if they're there. They consume about 0.6 grams per kilo per day. So, there are situations where it's clear that people aren't meeting their protein needs. But I'm not saying on a population level, and this is where the nuance is sort of lost, is that there's rife protein deficiency. There's not. There's rife overeating of, as you mentioned, hyperpalatable foods for sure.
And to bring in another perspective here, right? So as you're aging, there's loneliness, depression, issues with dentition, bad gums, bad teeth. People just aren't eating enough, right? Is it really that they're not getting enough protein, or they're not getting enough calories, or not enjoying their food enough? So to help some of these folks, it's not just that we would have to get them more protein. It's that we would have to improve their mood, their social lives, look at their teeth, etc. So I think it gets even more complex. If we were, Stu, to have the money to do those kinds of intervention studies, and we don't, but it would be nice. So if anybody's listening that wants to give us those funds, we're open. There would be a number of angles to address, and protein would absolutely be one of them, but it would be one of several.
No, I absolutely agree. Yeah. I mean, aging is a complex problem, and it's not solved by one thing or another. And that's the traditional grant-getting reductionist type approach that's probably been oversubscribed to without trying to bring together groups of individuals to talk about complex issues like cardiovascular disease, cancer, aging, from multiple perspectives rather than siloed ways of looking at it. I wouldn't disagree.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a comment on the YouTube videos or a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take notes of these comments when planning for future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. That's theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.